Alright guys, it's time for another series of video lectures. Today we are looking at chapter 7.1, Sec 3, chapter 7.1, which is the end of the war in Asia Pacific. Okay, and so before we start, remember you should have your handouts with you, you should have your writing materials, you should have slept enough, and you should be ready to go. Okay, but more than that, remember we have been working on how to study, right? And this is just a reminder. You should have only be listening to this after you have read the textbook and summarized it. Why? It's very simple, because this is meant to help you to consolidate your learning, to make sure that I can help you to pull the content together, to make connections between the different parts of the content. Okay, then after that you go and do your analysis, then you check again the slides. When you're building your mind maps, this is your own summary. Okay, this is where your own learning takes place. This is the real key step. Okay, because up to this part you are still just downloading information, so it is very important that you stop and you synthesize for yourself, then you do your homework, then of course you'll be able to do your homework well. Okay, so let's go. The end of World War II in the Pacific. This is the last chapter of the Sec 3 curriculum. In the Pacific, here in the Pacific, as opposed to Europe. And so straight away, once we talk about the Pacific, we know who is involved. We know it is Japan. We know it is the USA. Here, of course, we are referring to the Pacific Ocean. But we are also talking about the Pacific Theater of War. Basically, everything in World War II that happens in Asia. Okay, the Pacific Theater of War is a term that we use to refer to the area in which a war is being fought. Okay, World War II, once we look at it again, we need a timestamp. We need 1939 to 1945, but this is the entirety of the war. So remember that once it is World War II, we are only talking, once we're talking about World War II in the Pacific, we're talking about 1941 onwards. Okay, and if we're looking at the end, the question is what causes the end? Okay, this is very similar to what we have already looked at for the end of World War II in Europe. So the same factors will come into play. Okay, who is involved? Okay, what is the most important reason? And these are all questions that we are going to look at. Okay, so for this lecture, it's just the introduction to the important things which are going on. Okay, so these are the key questions. Which factor? Okay, we know that there are three factors. You should have seen this on your notes. Okay, most significant. Okay, most significant, we're talking about carries the most weight. Okay, all of them are important. Which is more important? Okay, and of course we also know that there is the use of the atomic bomb, whether something is justified. Now, justified, we are referring to whether it is, whether it is acceptable, whether it is reasonable. Okay, the atomic bomb, as we know, was 2 atomic bombs were dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which resulted in their destruction and the eventual Japanese surrender. However, was it justifiable to use weapons of mass destruction, okay, in order to end a war? That is one of the major questions that we need to discuss. Okay. So just to frame everything, let's go through the timeline. Now, the first 3 points, that is what we have already studied, right? 1931, Japan invades Manchuria, Japan leaves the League of Nations, second Sino-Japanese War. What is all this? Proof of all these is Japanese expansion, right? All these points to Japanese aggression. Okay. What else happens now? World War II breaks out in Europe. Remember what we've studied about that. This means that where is the attention of the colonial powers? Where is the attention of countries like the UK, the US, who are the colonial powers who have troops in Southeast Asia? Okay, all their attention is returned to Europe. Okay, so the French and the British particularly. Okay, so UK, France. Okay, so they are the colonial powers. The attention is in Europe. What is the implication of this, of course, is we know that this means that it's created a situation where it is easy for the Japanese to attack. Okay, and that is why we have the critical event here. This is the outbreak. Okay, Japan invades Pearl Harbor. This is the outbreak, which then means that the USA enters World War II on both sides, both Europe and Asia. Okay. Now the next thing we see is the Battle of Coruscant and Battle of Midway. This is the turning point of the war. Why? In between December 1941 here, this part, and June 1942, for the first 6 months, basically the Japanese are winning all the way. Only until the Battle of Midway does the momentum of the war swing in favor of the Americans. Okay. Now you see that Operation Overlord is the next date, 6 June 1944. Why is it here? Because here I want to make sure that you understand that World War II in Asia and World War II in the Pacific, even though they are in different chapters, we must recognize that they are part of the same history. Okay, because events in Europe will affect events in Asia, vice versa. Okay. So what we have is that now here Hitler is going to lose, right? And then we have 30th April, Hitler dies. What does this mean? This means Japan is left alone. And all the allies, all the military might of the allies is going to be focused on Japan. Okay? So everybody is starting to hit Japan now. Actually, mostly the USA. Then we have atomic bombs dropped, and then there is the Japanese surrender. Okay, so the questions that we need to think about are, why does Japan only surrender after the atomic bomb? Okay, and out of all these factors, did Japan make a mistake? Okay, was it the US who did most of the heavy lifting? Okay, which this is a map. If you see, it is in your textbook. It tells you where the Japanese are going. It is useful to have this in your head. Remember, Pearl Harbor is out there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in Hawaii. Okay, Nagasaki and Hiroshima are on the north of the map, and you can see how the Japanese are advancing. South is of course Australia. Okay, you will see that the Japanese basically took most of Southeast Asia. Okay, and all this is the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So the main actors that we want to look at in this chapter, of course, the USA and Japan. Towards the end of the chapter, we must consider the role of the USSR and Stalin. This will lead us nicely into the Cold War, but don't worry about that. That will be in Sec 4. But it is important to know the last point of the chapter, how, especially with the atomic bomb, how the USSR is involved. But mostly we are concerned with the USA and the USA and Japan and how they interact with each other. Bearing that in mind, that is how we arrive at the reasons for Japan's defeat. Firstly, we have Japanese mistakes and we have American might. You can see the parallels. Japan messed up. America is very, very strong. We saw this also in Europe. And if you think about it, economic and military power, these are the exact same points that we saw in the defeat of Germany. The difference here is that we have this new factor called the atomic bomb, which we will study in greater detail. Okay, basically, so let me give you a quick summary. The Japanese mistakes, basically they went too fast, too far, and they had not enough resources. Whereas the Americans, we know, have a lot of resources and they are always going to win a war of numbers. Okay. Allied strategy here, we are talking about how you can also think about it in terms of the rest of the world, global circumstances. Okay, how does the Allied victory in Europe affect Japan? That is why I talked about Hitler's defeat here. Okay, and how does the Allies, of course, they want to win a swift victory. Why? The faster I fight my war, the less soldiers have to die. This is, of course, related to why they use the atomic bomb. Okay, now as you listen to this, what you should be thinking about is not, okay, let me just write down everything Mr. Low has written down on the slide, but rather think about how the factors are related to each other. Think about what are the big topic sentences. Okay, so which is say American might, okay, cause the Japanese defeat because blah 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 blah. Okay, so that is where we will stop. The next few lectures, there should be 3 of them, maybe 4. Okay, we'll detail each factor. Okay, so make sure you read your textbook. See y'all.